Opening the center, d4 immediately challenges for central squares and aims to free up the queen and bishop for active development. Immediately contesting the center establishes a balanced pawn structure and opens the door for active piece development. Establishing central influence and preparing to castle swiftly, while also eyeing potential kingside advancements. Developing the knight mirrors white's intention, reinforcing central pawn structure and preparing for kingside castling. Challenging the central pawn structure immediately, white aims to seize initiative and potentially open lines for rapid piece development. Solidifying the center, this choice prepares to develop the bishop and offers a flexible pawn structure for future skirmishes. Fortifying the center, NC now prepares to contest black's pawn structure while developing another piece towards the king's flank. Solidifying the center, black prepares to castle and develop the kingside harmoniously. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, limiting black's options and preparing to challenge central control. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies the d5 pawn's defense and prepares for queenside expansion, a measured response to white's central ambitions. Solidifying the center and preparing to castle, white opts for a sensible development, prioritizing kingside safety and potentially aiming to control the d4 square with more pawns. Black signals an intention to fianchetto the bishop, aiming for a queenside expansion and potential pressure on white's central pawn structure. This maneuver prepares for bb7, which will contest white's control of the long diagonal and offer some relief from the central bind. Exchanging the central pawn immediately alters the game's character, opening lines and simplifying the position, potentially favoring the player with better piece coordination. Opening the central e-file now presents black with a choice: capture with the pawn to maintain symmetry, potentially leading to a more structured but less dynamic game, or consider a more complex recapture. The pawn's advance here dictates future pawn structures and influence over key squares. Unpinning the knight and immediately challenging the queen on the long diagonal creates significant central tension, forcing black to react to the dual threat of the bishop's pin and the queen's intrusion. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal on the queen side offers black excellent defensive coverage for the c8-h3 diagonal and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queen side, while simultaneously reinforcing the center indirectly. Aggressively challenging the dark-squared bishop on its attacking diagonal, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's queenside development and potentially exploit weaknesses if the bishop is forced to retreat awkwardly. White seeks to gain an initiative by forcing black to react and perhaps gain control of key squares. The bishop's sacrifice dramatically simplifies the position, offering immediate tactical relief for black from white's central pressure and opening the file for potential future activity. Capturing the bishop with the queen immediately opens the a-file, a significant positional gain that will soon pressure black's queenside pawn structure. Securing the monarch to the safer side of the board is paramount after the exchange on d5. This castling maneuver simultaneously readies the king for potential middle-game skirmishes and begins the crucial process of activating the rook. A crucial maneuver, the king's recent relocation promises a more secure haven behind a protective pawn shield, simultaneously unlocking potential attacking avenues through the now-open king's bishop diagonal for future aggressive endeavors. The central pawn structure is about to undergo a dramatic transformation as black challenges white's d4 foothold, aiming to liberate the queenside and create dynamic counterplay. Opening up the d-file for your rook now promises significant central influence and potential for a quick pawn push, but be mindful of the doubled c-pawns that arise from this pawn capture, creating a potential weakness that black might exploit later on. This recapture decisively breaks the central pawn structure, liberating black's queenside pawns and creating immediate tactical opportunities along the open c-file. Securing the d-file with this rook immediately exerts pressure on black's queenside structure, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns and the awkward placement of the queen after it was forced from the queenside. It's a solid step towards centralizing activity and preparing for potential pawn advances or piece sacrifices in that sector of the board. Immediately targeting the weakened queenside pawn structure, this move introduces significant queenside tension. Black is essentially daring white to defend the isolated c-pawn, which in turn might force a repositioning of white's queen to an even less active square. The queen's new placement also eyes the h2 square, creating a subtle but persistent threat should white's king escape its current fortress. Positioning the queen on d3 now aims to solidify central control, and eye the potentially weak pawn structure on the queenside that black has created by playing c5 and b6. White is not immediately seeking fireworks, but rather setting up a subtle pressure cooker, preparing for a potential central pawn push, or to transfer the queen to a more aggressive square like h3 if the opportunity arises, all while keeping an eye on the development of black's pieces and any potential tactical oversights. Suddenly, black initiates a bold pawn thrust, aiming to shatter white's centralized structure and gain a foothold on the queenside. This aggressive advance immediately challenges the queen's position and attempts to wrest control of the d4 square, creating dynamic tension. It's a double-edged sword, opening lines for black's pieces, but also potentially weakening the pawn chain and creating targets if white can exploit the ensuing imbalances. Reasserting central influence after black's ambitious pawn thrust, this repositioning aims to liberate the c2 square for potential piece development or a knight's advance, while also preparing to contest the d-file more effectively. Re-establishing the queenside blockade with the queen aims to solidify the pawn chain and prevent white's central control from expanding further. Securing the rook on its active file, white asserts control over the now open b-file, potentially setting up future pressure against black's queenside pawns or even the king if castling were to be disrupted. Initiating a knight maneuver to the queenside, nb6 aims to challenge white's dominant queen on d3 and potentially exploit the open b-file if the pawn structure shifts favorably. This positioning also creates a more cohesive defensive setup, preparing to meet potential kingside advances or central thrusts with a more robust structure. Observe how this subtle repositioning might disrupt white's previously established harmony, forcing a reassessment of immediate threats and long-term plans. An aggressive expansion along the queenside, aiming to secure a vital outpost for the knight and challenge black's pawn structure before the center fully solidifies, creating immediate dynamism. Securing the queenside flank becomes paramount as black anchors the rook, preparing to contest the b-file and potentially initiate counterplay, while white aims to solidify central influence and exploit the slightly less developed kingside. Pressing the queenside pawn structure, this aggressive advance aims to destabilize black's pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses on the b-file, a classic strategy in positions with symmetrical pawn structures. Black repositions the knight, a subtle but important maneuver to both defend the advanced pawn on c4 and prepare for potential activity on the queenside. The pawn structure has become quite tense, with white's queenside majority and black's isolated c-pawn creating distinct strategic battlegrounds. Black's previous moves have successfully held the pawn, but the long-term sustainability of that c4 pawn is questionable given white's control of the file and the potential for future pawn advances. This knight repositioning allows black to consolidate their position after white's aggressive pawn push. It's a defensive step that acknowledges the immediate pressure, aiming to build a more solid foundation before venturing into more ambitious plans. The knight's new home on d7 offers more defensive capabilities and could potentially swing over to the kingside if the opportunity arises, or support nb6c8 maneuver if needed. The key now is for black to coordinate their pieces effectively to neutralize white's queenside pressure and find counterplay. Challenging black's central control, this queen repositioning immediately eyes weaknesses on the queenside and forces black into a defensive posture, potentially setting up a dynamic attack on the exposed c5 pawn. Introducing a pawn to g6 disrupts white's dominant central pressure and attempts to gain breathing room for the kingside, although it creates a slight weakness on the light squares around the black king. Shifting the queen to the kingside offers fresh attacking perspectives, aiming to exploit the rather static pawn structure black has erected. However, it also creates a slight tempo loss and leaves the queen potentially exposed to future discoveries. Unpinning the knight from the queen and preparing for counterplay on the queenside, by developing the bishop is a solid positional step, aiming to challenge white's queenside initiative. The advance of the a-pawn aggressively seeks to exploit the queenside space, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering capabilities and potentially create weaknesses on the c-file. This pawn push is a bold declaration of intent, transforming a seemingly quiet pawn structure into a point of contention and forcing black to confront immediate territorial challenges. It signals a potential shift towards a more dynamic, perhaps even cramped, position for black if they cannot find immediate counterplay. The black queen now actively confronts white's queen, and simultaneously offers a critical pawn sacrifice to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Unlocking the g7 pawn's defensive structure, this bishop maneuver aims to create active counterplay on the queenside by reinforcing the a5 pawn and potentially eyeing the c7 square. Unlocking the c-file is the immediate objective, transforming this seemingly passive rook into an active participant poised to disrupt white's queenside structure. Reasserting dominion over the file, this maneuver aims to dislodge black's influential rook and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside. Reclaiming the central files is paramount, and Rf8 achieves just that by activating the rook and contesting the open d-file, preparing for potential skirmishes that could arise from the pawn chain's pressure. Initiating a bold knight maneuver, this placement seeks to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and generate attacking potential by targeting the vulnerable c6 square, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential pawn push on the queenside. The knight repositions to a more active square, ready to support potential advances and challenge white's control of the center. Injecting immediate pressure, knight aggressively probes the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn structure and seize control of key diagonals, forcing a difficult decision for the defender. Recapturing the queen immediately stabilizes the material balance and sidesteps any immediate tactical threats that might have arisen from the pawn structure shift, although it also concedes the bishop pair and allows white to maintain some central pressure. Unleashing a surprising counterthrust, white forces black's queen into an awkward, exposed position, disrupting its coordination with the rest of the army and creating immediate tactical questions for the defender. Black bravely ventures into a potentially dangerous outpost, seeking active counterplay against white's advanced pawn structure. Unleashing the knight's potential, this maneuver strategically repositions it to a more menacing square, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and exploit weaknesses that have emerged on the queenside, forcing a reassessment of black's material advantage. Suddenly, a desperate attempt to untangle the positional knot, relocating the queen to a slightly more active square where it can potentially support counterplay along the 7th rank, though it offers no immediate respite from the relentless pressure building on white's queenside. Seizing the initiative with the knight's bold jump, white aggressively aims to dismantle black's defensive structure, forcing a critical decision on how to address the immediate material imbalance. Embracing the endgame transition, this relocation of the rook opens the file and prepares for potential activation on the 7th rank, while simultaneously defending the threatened knight. Targeting the weakened dark squares around black's king becomes a pressing concern after securing the exchange, with this piece repositioning to exploit potential weaknesses. Unburdening the king from the center allows the bishop a more active diagonal, preparing for a potential counterattack on the queenside while solidifying defense. Consolidating power on the 2nd rank, this maneuver aims to bolster the defense of the vulnerable king's flank and prepare for a potential advance of the pawn, creating a distant past threat. Unleashing the knight to its natural outpost, nc5 injects immediate activity and disrupts white's queenside control, creating a dynamic imbalance where black seeks compensation for the pawn deficit through active piece play. Reclaiming the initiative with a bishop repositioning, that square now offers a better perspective on black's somewhat fragmented pawn structure on the queenside, potentially preparing for a future advance or to shore up weaknesses if black tries to exploit the open c-file. A bold repositioning, the knight from the central scrum plunges toward white's queenside, aiming to disrupt the harmony of black's pieces and potentially establish a strong outpost on c2 or b2, a calculated risk given the current piece placement. Shifting the queen to h4 initiates a potent dual threat, aiming to exploit the open kingside diagonal and potentially prepare for a decisive kingside assault, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the c4 square, which has become a critical outpost for black's knight. A subtle retreat, this queen repositioning now eyeballs the weak d3 square, simultaneously preparing to defend its own king and potentially redeploy to a more active role on the queenside should the opportunity arise. Unlocking the knight's potential is key here. Repositioning it to e2 aims to redeploy it more effectively, perhaps towards f4 or even g3, to bolster the kingside or challenge black's active pieces. This maneuver hints at a subtle shift in white's strategy, moving away from immediate pawn aggression towards a more controlled positional buildup, preparing for a later, more decisive assault. Sacrificing the knight on f2 now, with the queen and rooks somewhat awkwardly placed, feels like a desperate attempt to disrupt white's superior piece coordination and create chaos on the kingside. This gambit, while offering immediate tactical possibilities, sacrifices immediate material for potential initiative. It's a bold bet that white's king will become exposed, or that the ensuing complications will overwhelm white's development, but it leaves black down a piece for what might be an insufficient attack, especially with white's rook poised on the open file and the knight controlling key central squares. A perilous king walk begins, exposing the monarch to immediate danger from black's advanced knight and queen, a gamble that prioritizes material gain over paramount safety. Igniting a fiery tactical sequence, the knight's audacious leap to e4 immediately disrupts white's kingly sanctuary, probing for weaknesses and threatening cascading discoveries. Confronting the onslaught, white chooses a bold recapture, accepting the immediate material deficit for a chance to disrupt black's initiative and potentially exploit the compromised position of the black king. The pawn capture opens up the e-file, presenting a new tactical avenue for black to exploit the compromised white king position. Capturing the knight on e7 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening up a clear path for your remaining pieces to directly assault the weakened black king. Pivoting the rook to the back rank initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, aiming to solidify the beleaguered king's sanctuary from further immediate assault and potentially prepare for a repositioning to a more active role later in the endgame. Preserving the bishop pair becomes paramount now that the knight is on its last leg, aiming to neutralize black's active pieces and exploit the potential weaknesses around the exposed king. Initiating a strategic repositioning, the rook embarks on a journey to the queenside, seeking fresh avenues for engagement and potentially bolstering its defensive capabilities against any future incursions on that flank. Recapturing the knight opens up the c-file and potentially connects the rooks, but it also releases pressure on white's king and allows black's passed pawn on e4 to become a more potent threat. Seeking refuge for the monarch, the king shifts to a more sheltered square amidst the chaotic exchange of pieces, hoping to establish a more stable defensive posture against the persistent threats from white's active pieces. This repositioning of the bishop prepares to contest the light squares and potentially shore up the kingside after the pawn push. Embracing the open e-file, black repositions the rook, ready to contest the central squares and potentially prepare for further infiltration or defense against white's advanced pawns. Opening the defile for the rook offers a significant opportunity to challenge black's central pawn structure, potentially leading to a more active position for white's pieces. Seeking to revive the stagnant position, black aims to activate the queen and potentially create threats along the third rank, but this audacious gambit offers white opportunities to consolidate and exploit the misplaced queen. Relocating the rook to the second rank offers flexibility, potentially supporting pawn advances or preparing for a swift redeployment to the central files, thereby increasing pressure on black's consolidated position. Securing the queenside flank becomes a paramount concern. By advancing the pawn, black aims to solidify that territory and perhaps initiate future pawn breakthroughs, preventing white from easily exploiting the open files or potential weaknesses there. Asserting control over the open, a file now opens new avenues for attack. Unlocking the kingside for potential pawn advances, this move fundamentally alters the defensive structure, potentially preparing for a later e5 push to destabilize the opponent's central pawn majority and create active counterplay. Pushing the rook to the c-file now aims to exploit the potentially weakened pawn structure on that side and challenge black's control over the open file, potentially leading to tactical skirmishes or forcing black into defensive concessions. Opening a new dimension of potential tactical skirmishes, this advance of the g-pawn seeks to create breathing room for the king by widening the escape square, while simultaneously preparing a later pawn push to contest the h-file, potentially disrupting white's defensive structure and hinting at a future queenside expansion. Unleashing the h-pawn opens a critical diagonal, potentially creating mating threats and disrupting black's defensive structure around the king. Shattering the pawn's shield around white's king, black opens a dangerous diagonal for the rook and potentially the queen, aiming to exploit the compromised kingside. Initiating a strategic reshuffle, this capture aims to seize the initiative on the kingside, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and opening avenues for attack. Shifting the queen to the queenside opens up avenues for the rooks to become more active on the open files, potentially creating threats against white's otherwise solid pawn structure. Exploiting the discovered check on the king forces a significant material concession, transforming the board into a stark exchange scenario where white aims to leverage their remaining pawn structure. Confronting the discovered attack and seeking to disrupt white's rook battery, black opts for a king repositioning, aiming to create an escape square and potentially activate his remaining pieces in the endgame. The bishop retreats, eyeing the weakened pawns on the kingside and offering a passive defense against any immediate breakthroughs, hoping to create a more stable pawn structure to weather the storm. Pushing the h-pawn forward like this creates a significant weakness on the kingside, potentially opening lines for attack against your monarch and offering white a target to exploit. Focusing the king's safety becomes paramount with the looming pawn storm on the kingside. The black king, now exposed on the h-file, presents a tempting target. Retreating the rook to e8 aims to consolidate defensive resources and perhaps prepare for a potential pawn push later, though it concedes some initiative to white. Snatching the pawn with the knight dramatically alters the material balance and injects immediate tactical complications, forcing a sharp reevaluation of black's defensive structure. Seeking fresh air for its queen, black's move aims to untangle the position, freeing the queen from its passive sentinel duty on the third rank and preparing to contest the open files with increased mobility. Unleashing a discovered check, this knight sprint forces the black king into a more exposed position, creating immediate tactical opportunities for white.